Chapter 25. It was autumn. The summer was gone. It passed as quickly as it had come. How quickly it was gone. The days were cold now. I went out shooting and fishing, sang songs in the woods, and there were days with thick mist that came floating in from the sea, damming up everything behind a wall of murk. One such day something happened. I lost my way, blundered through into the woods of an annex, and came into the doctor's house. There were visitors there, the young ladies I had met before, young people dancing just like madcap foals. A carriage came rolling up and stopped outside the gate. Eduarda was in it. She started at the sight of me. "Goodbye," I said quietly, but the doctor held me back. Eduarda was troubled by my presence at first and looked down when I spoke. Afterwards she bore with me and even went so far as to ask me a question about something or other. She was strikingly pale. The mist lay gray and cold upon her face. She did not get out of the carriage. "I had come on an errand," she said. "I come from the parish church, and none of you were there today. They said you were here. I've been driving for hours to find you. We are having a little party tomorrow. The Baron is going away next week, and I have been told to invite you all. There will be dancing, too, tomorrow evening." They all bowed and thanked her. To me, she went on, "Now, don't stay away, will you? Don't send a note at the last minute making some excuse." She did not say that to any of the others. A little after she drove away, I was so moved by this unexpected meeting that for a little while I was secretly mad with joy. Then I took leave of the doctor and his guests and set off for home. How gracious she was to me! How gracious she was to me! How could I do for her in return? My hands felt helpless. A sweet cold went through my wrists. "Oh God," I thought to myself, "here I am with my limbs hanging helpless for joy. I cannot even clench my hands. I can only find tears in my eyes for my own helplessness. What is to be done about that?" It was late in the evening when I reached home. I went round by the quay and asked the fishermen if the post packet would not be in by tomorrow evening. Alas, no, the post packet would not be in till sometime next week. I hurried up to the hut and began looking over my best suit. I cleaned it up and made it look decent. There were holes in it here and there, and I wept and darned them. When I had finished, I lay down on the bed. This rest lasted only a moment. Then a thought struck me, and I sprang up and stood in the middle of the floor, dazed. The whole thing was just another trick. I should not have been invited. If I had not happened to be there when the others were asked. And moreover, she had given me the plainest possible hint to stay away, to send a note at the last moment, making some excuse. I did not sleep all that night, and when morning came, I went to the woods, cold, sleepless, and feverish. Oh, having a party at Surland, what then? I would neither go nor send any excuse. Ermac was a very thoughtful man. He was giving this party for the Baron, but I was not going. Let them understand that. The mist lay thick over the valley and the hills. A clammy rime gathered on my clothes and made them heavy. My face was cold and wet. Only now and then came a breath of wind to make the sleeping mists rise and fall, rise and fall. It was late in the afternoon, getting dark. The mist hid everything from my eyes, and I had no sun to show the way. I drifted about for hours on the way home, but there was no hurry. I took the wrong road with the greatest calmness and came upon unknown places in the woods. At last I stood my gun against a tree and consulted my compass. I marked out my way carefully and started off. It would be about 8 or 9 o'clock. Then something happened. After half an hour, I heard music through the fog, and a few minutes later, I knew where I was. quite close to the main building at Surland. Had my compass misled me to the very place I was trying to avoid? A well-known voice called me. The doctor's. A minute later, I was being led in. My gun barrel had perhaps affected the compass and alas set it wrong. The same thing had happened to me since. One day this year, I do not know what to think. Then, too, it may have been fate. Chapter 26. All the evening I had bitter feelings that I should not have come to the party. My coming was hardly noticed at all. They were all so occupied with one another. Edwarda hardly bade me welcome. I began drinking hard because I knew I was unwelcome, and yet I did not go away. Ermac smiled a great deal and put on his most amiable expression. He was in his evening dress and looked well. He was now here, now there, mingling with his 100 guests, dancing one dance now and then, joking and laughing. There were secrets lurking in his eyes. A whirl of music and voices sounded through the house. 5 of the rooms were occupied by guests, besides the big room where they were dancing. Supper was over when I arrived. Busy maids were running to and fro with glasses of wine, brightly polished coffee pots, cigars and pipes, cakes and fruits. There were no sparing of anything. The chandeliers in the room were filled with extra thick candles that had been made for this occasion. The new oil lamps were lit as well. Ava was helping in the kitchen. I caught a glimpse of her. To think that Ava should be here too. The Baron received a great deal of attention, though. He was quiet and modest and did not put himself forward. He, too, was in his evening dress. The tails of his coat were miserably crushed from the packing. He talked a good deal with Edwarda, followed her with his eyes, drank with her, and called her Frauchen, as he did the daughters of the dean and the district surgeon. I felt the same dislike of him as before, and could hardly look at him without turning my eyes away with a wretched, silly grimace. When he spoke to me, I answered shortly and pressed my lips together afterward. I happened to remember one detail of that evening. I stood talking to a young lady, a fair-haired girl, and I said something or told some story that made her laugh. It can hardly have been anything remarkable, but perhaps in my excited state I told it more amusingly than I remember now. At any rate, I've forgotten it. But when I turned around, there was Edwarda standing behind me. She gave me a glance of recognition. Afterwards, I noticed that she drew the fair girl aside to find out what I had said. I cannot say how that look of Edwarda cheered me. After I had been going about from room to room like a sort of outcast all evening, I felt better at once, and spoke to several people, and was entertaining. As far as I'm aware, I did nothing awkward or wrong. I was standing outside on the steps. Ava came carrying some things from one of the rooms. She saw me, came out, and touched my hand swiftly with one of hers. Then she smiled and went in again. Neither of us had spoken. When I turned to go in after her, there was Edwarda in the passage, watching me. She also said nothing. I went into the room. Fancy Lieutenant Glunt amuses himself having meetings with the servants on the steps, said Edwarda suddenly out loud. She was standing in a doorway. Several heard what she said. She laughed as if speaking in jest, but her face was very pale. I made no answer to this. I only murmured, "It was accidental. She came out, and we met in the passage." Some time passed, an hour perhaps. Glass was upset over a lady's dress. As soon as Edwarda saw it, she cried, "What has happened?" "That was Glunt, of course." I had not done it. I was standing at the other end of the room when it happened. After that, I drank pretty hard again and kept near the door to be out of the way of the dancers. The Baron still had the ladies constantly around him. He regretted that his collections were packed away so that he could not show them that bunch of weed from the White Sea, the clay from Colomerne, highly interesting stones formations from the bottom of the sea. The ladies peeped curiously at his shirt studs, a 5-pointed cornets. They meant that he was a baron, of course. All this time, the doctor created no sensation. Even his witty Dodog pencil no longer had any effect. But with Eduardo speaking, he was always on the spot, correcting her language, embarrassing her with little shades of meaning, keeping her down with calm superiority. She said, "Until I go over the Valley of Death." And the doctor asked, "Over what?" "The Valley of Death. Isn't that what it's called, the Valley of Death?" "I've heard the River of Death. I presume that's what you mean." Later on, she talked of having something guarded like a dragon, put in the doctor. "Yes, like a dragon," she answered, but the doctor said, "You can thank me for saving you there. I'm sure you were going to say Argus." The Baron raised his eyebrows and looked at the doctor in surprise through his thick glasses, as if he had never heard such ridiculous things, but the doctor paid no heed. What did he care for the Baron? I still lurked by the door. The dancers swept through the room. I managed to start a conversation with the governess from the vicarage. We talked about the war, the state of affairs in Crimea, and the happenings in France, Napoleon as emperor, his protection of the Turks. The young lady had read the papers that summer and could tell me the news. At last we sat down on a sofa and went on talking. Eduarda, passing, stopped in front of us. Suddenly she said, "You must forgive me, Lieutenant, for surprising you outside like that. I will never do it again." And she laughed again and did not look at me. "Eduarda," I said, "do stop." She had spoken very formally, which meant no good, and her look was malicious. I thought of the doctor and shrugged my shoulders carelessly, as he would have done. She said, "But why don't you go out in the kitchen? Ava's there. I think you ought to stay there." And there was hate in her eyes. I had not been to parties often. Certainly I had never before heard such a tone at any of the few I'd been to. I said, "Aren't you afraid of being misunderstood, Eduarda?" "Oh, but how? Possibly, of course, but how?" "You sometimes speak without thinking. Just now, for instance, it seemed to me you were actually telling me to go in the kitchen and stay there, and that, of course, must be a misunderstanding. I know quite well that you did not intend to be so rude." She walked a few paces away from us. I could see by her manner that she was thinking all the time of what I had said. She turned around, came back, and said breathlessly, "It was no misunderstanding, Lieutenant. You heard correctly. I did tell you to go to the kitchen." "Oh, Eduarda," broke out the terrified governess. And I began talking again about the war and the state of affairs in Crimea. But my thoughts were far distant. I was no longer intoxicated, only hopelessly confused. The earth seemed fading under my feet, and I lost my composure. As so many unfortunate times before, I got up from the sofa and made as if to go out. The doctor stopped me. "I have just been hearing your praises," he said. "Praises from whom?" "From Eduarda. She is still standing away off there in the corner, looking at you with glowing eyes. I shall never forget it. Her eyes were absolutely in love, and she said out loud that she admired you." "Good," I said with a laugh. Alas, there was not a clear thought in my head. I went up to the Baron, bent over him as if to whisper something, and when I was close enough, I spat in his ear. He sprang up and stared idiotically at me. Afterwards, I saw him telling Eduarda what had occurred. I saw how disgusted she was. She thought, perhaps, of her shoe that I had thrown into the water, of the cups and glasses I had so unfortunately managed to break, and of all the other breaches of good taste I had committed. Doubtless, all those things flashed into her mind again. I was ashamed. It was all over with me. Whichever way I turned, I met frightened and astonished looks, and I stole away from Surland without a word of leave-taking or of thanks.